Hello and welcome to our Reading Matters webinar. I'm your host, Martina Devlin. I'm a journalist and author, and I present a books podcast called City of Books. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to be talking to a cracking panel lined up for you by the National Adult Literacy Agency, NALA. This webinar is part of the Ireland's Reads campaign. That's a public libraries initiative designed to get the entire country reading, so no pressure there. And it leads up to a National Day of Reading tomorrow, Thursday, which celebrates all the benefits from the written word, ranging from a sense of well-being to just plain enjoyment. More information on www.irelandreads.ie. Now, our aim is to break the fear factor that surrounds reading for some people. In Ireland, 1 in 6, or more than 500,000 adults, struggle with reading. Many say they lack the confidence to pick up a book, but reading doesn't have to be about taking on a whole book. It can be a short story, an article in a magazine, a newspaper, or on a website. It helps to start with material that's easier to read. Don't forget short books and short stories. That's how the Open Day series and quick reads came about. And the latest Open Door book is called Voices, a collection of short stories by 27 Irish writers, so someone for everyone in there. Now, if anyone watching this would like to brush up on their reading, do please consider ringing the NALA free phone on 1800 20 20 65 and they'll talk you through your options. So, today's webinar, we'll be looking at why reading matters to people and what the benefits are. And if you've any questions for the panel, do think about using the web chat and ask them. Our first guest is an inspirational man. He's called Michael Duffy, and he's an adult literacy ambassador. Michael learned to read at the age of 57, and all credit to him for realising it's never too late. Michael, what happened that you fell between the cracks when you went to school in Cavan?
Well, when I was going to school back in the late 50s, early 60s, by the way, I'm 66 years of age, and I couldn't read until I was start to learn how to read until I was 57. I suppose it was one of those times we'd say that if you were very bright in the school and something like that, and you were interested in a particular hobby, and especially in our school, if you're interested in Gaelic football and things like that, you were brought on. But if you weren't, you were sort of left on the back burner. And I wasn't at school. I wasn't given homework or things like that, because I thought that was brilliant. I was out playing outside, other ones getting homework and things like that. But as I got older and things changed, I realised I had made a mistake, and they were the intelligent ones. So I left school at 14, going on 14. I got a job with a local farmer doing bits and pieces on the land, and kept on tricking away at that for a number of years. Then I got a job in a local milk processing plant in our local town, Killishandra. And I kept on at that, worked away at that, and the money was very good at the time. And back then, you didn't really need to have the people, and no disrespect to anyone, but you didn't need any literacy abilities to do a manual work at the time. And then the times changed, kept moving on, and then technology took over the world. And I used to hear people saying, you've seen such a thing on Facebook and Instagram and something like that, and I had no idea what those were, and Twitter, and I thought that was just a board outside. I didn't know anything about Twitter or anything like that. And there was a class starting on computers in our local centre, and I decided I'd sign up for this and go into this. But I didn't realise starting on a class, you had to prepare a portfolio which involved reading, writing, and etc., which that's what happened to me. I wasn't fit to do that. I was going to pull out of the class, but our local AOL, Adult Literacy Organiser at the branch, organised a one-to-one for me, and I went to that for a number of months and moved on and progressed on. And I have now done a number of level 4 QTY courses, communications, maths, and a number of other courses. But the biggest thing for me, and we're talking about reading books and reading books, is it opens up a whole new world to me. I read about very inspirational people, that such as, just I'll pick one, a particular book I'm reading now is May McAleese's story, like, I mean, autobiography. I like reading autobiographies about people because you get to know the real person, you get to know what they're thinking. Another one I read, I seem to be advertising books here, is Tony Ryan, the guy that set up Ryanair. Like, I mean, he was an absolute inspirational man. We talk about Michael O'Leary. He was nothing compared to what Tony Ryan was. When you read the book and you see the things like that, that's just an example of how it opens up a whole new world to me. And another thing is, I lift a newspaper now. I can read an article in it. I can go into it. I know we're not going into pubs now, but hopefully we will sometime. But you can go in there, you can sit down, you can have an intelligent conversation with someone about the particular article. I'm not just reading the pictures now. I'm reading the story. And when you can read a story entirely, you get the full picture. And you understand. And that's where I'm coming from.
Were there no times during those 57 years before you learned to read when it impacted on your life, when you thought, maybe I should learn?
Absolutely. Take for instance now, I'll just give you one instance. We'd say when I went long ago, before there was technology, before you were taxing your car online, you had to go in physically with a form, you had to fill in the form, you had to do things like that. And that was something that you learned how to duck and dive around corners. You go up with the form like you meant to the girl and say, gosh, I forgot my glasses, or could you help me with this, or different things. You just make up excuses. I suppose when I wasn't fit to read or write, I got another skill of having to dodge not having to do it. Like things like that. And most people would help you out. You could say get a form in the hospital, like, I mean, for some, you could say, well, I'll bring that home now and I'll fill it in and I'll drop it back with you tomorrow. That kind of thing. Rather than walking up to the front desk, lifting the form and things like that. Another aspect of it was medication. We'd say you get a prescription and I know the prescriptions that doctors write is still very difficult to read, but get the medication. Like what I used to do was, we'd say you take the green tablet at 2 o'clock, you take the blue tablet at 3 o'clock, and so on like that. That's the way to distinguish out things like that. So you get to learn how to do things like that. So that's my.
It must have been exhausting finding all these coping mechanisms. How did it make you feel?
In some places, it made me feel, I suppose, inferior to other people that could walk up to the front desk and they could fill in the form, they could things like that. I felt, I suppose, in a way, I wasn't fit to participate fully in society and things like that. Now, I'll just give you another example. Which I was very interested in cookery, but and I used to follow cookery programs on TV and things like that. But you give me a recipe then to follow, to actually go into the store, buy the stuff like that. I couldn't read the recipe. That was something that I felt a bit taken back. Sorry, my screen's moving. That's a bit taken back. Now I can lift a cookbook, read recipe, cook it up. It mightn't be great when it comes out at the end, but it's done anyway. That kind of a thing. You know, what I'm saying is being able to read opens up a whole new life, a whole new door to anyone that wants to read, because I'd encourage anyone to lift a book and read it. As the previous speaker said, it doesn't have to be a huge book, any little thing like that, a little article in the paper, things like that. It's just any little thing, because a lot of people think that I read a book, they're thinking a book with about 500-600 pages in it. I say no, do that. The first book I read in the one-to-one, oh God, I didn't like it when I just think of it now. It's a story of if any of us remember the time Roy Keane walked out of the game in Taipan, and it was a little book about, it was only about a few pages in it. It was just a little bit. And I didn't like the book and I didn't like the subject, but as doing the one-to-one, I had to read it, that kind of thing.
What
So
was
that was
the
really,
turning point for you? What was the turning point for you when you got to 57? What made you think, enough already, I have to take control of this situation?
well, as I said earlier in my introduction, technology was the thing that turned my head. Like, I mean, when I went into, I had got a laptop back about 2 years before that. It sat in our sitting room with a pile of stuff through on top of it, and I used to look in every so often and wonder what kind of a yoke that was. I knew nothing about it, absolutely nothing. But when I went in to do the class, then the tutor could see that I had literacy difficulties and hit me off on the one-to-one, and then moved me on to level 3 QQI courses in communications and different things like that. And now I'm going on ahead now. I'm not doing that at the moment because nobody is doing that at the moment. But I've done a level 4 communications, which I found fantastic. I've done level 4 maths, level 4 internet skills, things like that. So the look at that, it's just little progression, little by little, that
So
it's
it's
changed my life. But
technology really that was the turning point for you.
technology was the turning point for me, absolutely, because
Did you
I just had this little bit.
did you feel that reading was about being brainy? Was that a deterrent?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I'd say is that because, and that's something that I think a lot of people has a misperception of that. Being able to read a book doesn't mean you're brainy, because a lot of people is very good at reading and very good at academic things like that, but that doesn't mean they're brainy. I know that probably goes against some of the aspects of what this group is about, but we say people can be brainy in other fields and different
Of
fields like
course.
that. But what I'm saying is, I'm a French polisher by trade, but that's a skill in itself. Reading a book is a skill in itself. And I think one by one, like I mean, but you have to combine with the two of them, because learning to read a book is brilliant and it's great, but it's where it takes you the next step, what door what opportunity it opens for you. That's the big one. Now I do voluntary
Do
work
you
with
have
a
any
suicide.
advice? Do you have any advice for people who might be nervous about reading?
Yes, what I'd say to people that's nervous about reading is just find something that they're very interested in, whether it be beekeeping, whether it be stamp collection, whether it be antiques, something like that. Find out something that they're really interested in, have a passion for, and get some books connected with that particular subject. Don't be trying to read something that's absolutely that they have no interest in, because that will put them off. If they have an interest in antiques, in history or something like that, get something that they are interested in, look at that and study that. They mightn't get
And
every word. They might miss.
you
Sorry?
find biographies
I
interest you?
I find learning about people is very interesting. It's very educational because you get to know the real person. You see the person being interviewed on the TV for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever length of time it is. You only get a snapshot of what that person is like. But when you read the book and read their autobiography, you get to know more about what that person is like. So that gives
So
you
what have you
more
found
knowledge.
out about Mary McAleese from her book, her
I
autobiography?
I found out that well, first of all, she's a very inspirational lady. First of all, she's not shy to challenge society, such as churches or different things like that. She's not afraid to, and she's an ordinary person. There was brought up in a very in the falls, like I'm in Rhodes area, Belfast, like I'm in off. They live in Roscommon now, so she is. So she's just blending in as an ordinary person, fitting in. She hasn't this big airs and grace. So she's just an ordinary lady to everyone. That's what I find about her. That's what relates me.
Great. Well, look, we're going to move on to the next part of our webinar. Michael, thank you very much for sharing your story. You know, you've been really candid, and I think it will help a lot of people. Well done. So we're moving on now to Dr. Sabina Brennan, who's a health psychologist and neuroscientist. Sabina hosts the Super Brain podcast, where she interviews inspiring individuals. Her first book was a bestseller, 100 Days to a Younger Brain, and her second book, Beating Brain Fog, is about to be published. Sabina, tell us about the brain and why brain health matters.
Sure. The thing about the brain is it's probably our most forgotten organ. It's certainly, in a way, our most underused organ. Every single person has inside their skull the most complex structure in the known universe. And we're really not maximizing our potential. We pay more attention to our teeth every day than we do to our brain health. I think part of that issue is if you ask people to think of the human brain, they think of this horrible, crinkly, beige that looks like a big lump of fat. And the brain only looks like that because it's been preserved in formaldehyde. What I would suggest to people after this podcast is for them to Google brainbow, not rainbow, brainbow, and they will see images of the brain, multicolored images that show the brain in its true dynamic condition, which is that we've got 86 billion neurons inside your head and trillions of connections that communicate with each other and with the other cells in your body through electrical and chemical signals. And what you do and what you don't do influence how well your brain functions. So what you think, how you behave, your lifestyle choices, your experience, they all influence how well your brain functions. And one really exciting thing about the brain is there's a fancy scientific word for it called neuroplasticity, but all that is a term that describes that the brain has the capacity to adapt and change with learning. So that is in fact how we learn. The brain grows new connections every time it learns something new. And the interesting thing about reading is that reading is not innate. So by that, I mean your brain was not designed to read. You know, as our brain evolved, there's certain capacity at our brain where, we have regions in our brain for sight, at the back of the brain here, for speech and for noise processing and for movement. We have areas in the brain, but there's no area in the brain for reading. So like Michael said, reading is just a learned skill. So it's not that anybody is born more or less able to learn, although some people have challenges, and both my son and my husband have dyslexia. So I'm very familiar when people have challenges around those kind of things. But it is a learned behavior. I think for some people like Michael, our education system fails them. Perhaps they learn in a different way, or perhaps their curiosity isn't sparked. And again, speaking back to what Michael said, that's the thing. If you pick up something that you're curious about, the thing is, curiosity itself enhances your ability to learn. So if you are learning to read, if you are reading about a subject that you are curious about, your neuroplasticity will work better. You will actually learn better. So that's absolutely critical. And I think sometimes that doesn't happen in the educational system. Our ability to read developed because the brain can change and adapt and grow new connections. And it harnesses some of our visual areas, our hearing areas, etc. And the more you read, the more connections you can grow. But similarly, the less you read, even if you've been a reader before, you'll start to lose those connections, but you can reinvigorate them.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the education system when Michael was young, perhaps let him down. It's not that uncommon then for people to leave schooling without being able to read. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know that I don't know the figures. People from NALA will know, but I certainly have encountered people. I give talks, etc., and sometimes people will come up to me and say, I love your book. Is it available on Audible? Because I can't read. Now, some of those might be of older generations, but I do think there are people who may have certain language processing issues or dyslexias, who may have challenges. My own husband, he can read. He left school like you, Michael, at about 14 or 15, and he went into a print trade. He can read and would read newspapers and that sort of thing, but he would tend, can happen to some people, to sort of fall asleep with reading. The challenge of reading sort of exhausts him, and that's not uncommon. So he never really read a book. I think he read a couple of autobiographies like you. He was interested in people, sports people. But I'm so excited because only recently with lockdown, I introduced him to Audible. So now physical activity is one of the best things that you can do for your brain health. And you might wonder how that can link to reading. But I listen to Audible when I'm walking, and you still are getting some of the benefits, because you're transported into another world and you learn about relationships, and, if you're reading fiction. So my husband now, I read his first novel in January, and he is now on novel number 8. He is doing loads of walking, and he can't believe it himself. But I touched on there about brain health, and how we can keep our brain healthy. And the thing is, as I said, physical activity is very good, very important for your brain health. It needs nutrients and oxygen and a healthy cardiovascular system. But from research, what we know is we can divide the things that keep your brain healthy into activity, attitude, and lifestyle. So activity would be physical activity. Social engagement, staying social, is critical for brain health. It's very challenging at the moment during lockdown. One way reading can help that is that you can substitute some of your it'll never be a real replacement, but substitute some of your social relationships with the relationships of characters in a book, in a novel. You get to know them, and you feel with them, and you think about what they might be going to do next. So in some ways that mimics a real social relationship. The thing that people associate most with brain health is mental stimulation. And of course, reading provides that, and particularly if you're challenging yourself, because that actually improves brain connectivity. And it's really important to be curious about stuff. When it comes to lifestyle, looking after your heart is going to look after your brain. And what's really interesting is, with the right kind of book, and by that I mean a book that's not going to stress you out or is too difficult to read or too challenging, or the subject matter is depressing. If you read a book that is enjoyable, within 30 minutes you can lower your blood pressure. So reading is good for your heart and therefore good for your brain. Basically, then, sleep is absolutely critical for brain health. Your memories are consolidated in the evening. You can't learn unless you've had a good night's sleep. You literally don't, your brain doesn't have the capacity to do it. So sleep is critical. So if you want to learn to read, make sure that you're getting good night's sleep. But often reading is a way to wind down from the day. Switch off the technology, read a paper copy of a book, and it can gradually wind you and lull you into a sleep. When it comes to attitude, managing stress is critical, and I honestly believe reading can offer that respite from stress, because if you get lost in a book, you are truly in the present moment. You're in there in that moment. People could call you and you mightn't hear them because you're so in there, and so you're moved away from thinking about the past, anxious thoughts or depressed thoughts, or worrying about the future. You're in the moment, and that's a great stress buster. And then also laughter and smiling are natural stress busters. They're absolutely brilliant for the brain. They have loads of benefits, including boosting your immune function. And so if you read books that bring you joy and make you smile or make you laugh, you're going to be boosting your brain health as well.
Sabina, why are so many of us experiencing brain fog during lockdown? Is it to do with lack of social interaction?
I think it's a combination of things. So people are experiencing disrupted sleep. For a lot of them, they're in a kind of chronic state of stress. Also, their routines are gone. because they're at home. And routine is very important for the brain. This organ only weighs about 2% of your body, but it consumes about 25% of the nutrients and oxygen that you use at any point in time. So it's a very high energy organ, particularly what's called the neocortex, which is the outer crinkly part, the thinking part of the brain. So when you engage in habitual activity, the thinking part of the brain doesn't have to engage in it. It's carried out by a lower part of the brain that is less resource heavy. And I think a lot of people have disrupted, they've no real routine in their life, which means they have to think about everything they're doing. And that's exhausting. And really brain fog in some regard comes down to, in some ways, to a resource issue. Your brain is actually overwhelmed. So I would suggest that people actually reintroduce routines and make work a place rather than a thing. By that I mean is, have it in one part of your home only. I'm suggesting that people introduce a commute, walk around the block, have your breakfast routine, walk around the block, dress for work, do your work day, take a break at lunchtime, go for a run or a walk at lunchtime. It enhances learning in the afternoon and counteracts that natural lull in the afternoon. And then at the end of the day, do that other commute home, maybe have a shower, change your clothes, and that way you can put this sort of a structure on your day, but also really divide that day, because we're on far too much. We're working far too often. And then if you do that, you'll have much more time to read and enjoy books.
And is there anything people can do to improve concentration so that we do read more?
You can train your concentration. So obviously, you will improve concentration if you do things like, looking after your sleep, managing stress, exercising, etc., because they all will improve your general brain health. But yes, you can train concentration. And it's a little bit like you were talking about, start small. So, a lot of people when they're stressed feel, oh no, I can't even concentrate on a book. Okay, that's a whole book and you're thinking of sitting down to read for half an hour. Say to yourself, I'm going to just stop and I'm going to, depending on how bad your concentration is, I'm going to read a paragraph or I'm going to read a page, and leave it at that. Just do that today, do that tomorrow, do that for a few days, then increase it. And I'm going to read, 2 pages this week, and just gradually build up. That's how anything works. That's how we learn anything. We learn incrementally. And often we forget that with things. It's like, I can't read or I can read. No, you might be in the process of reading, and reading actually is something that continues to evolve, and we continue to learn when you explore new genres and things like that. And same as your vocabulary is something that is continuing to grow. As I'm sure, Michael, you're finding out with reading, that you're learning more and more, new words, and those kind of things can have a huge impact then in life, because when your vocabulary improves, so too do opportunities in life, in terms of interviews and conversations and those kind of things that Michael was talking about. So start small, repeat that, get used to that. You can even just monitor with a timer. If you wanted to say I'm going to read for 5 minutes, you could click a little timer on for every minute and see whether you were still focused or whether your mind had started to wander. So it really is actually just that skill thing. And I should say to people, learning to read is easier than learning a new language.
Well, that's something, because it's learning a new language can be tricky. Sabina, thank you for that. So next up we have John Shortall, County Librarian for Carlow Libraries. John, tell us about your journey as a reader. Did you take to reading immediately?
Hi, Martina. I did. I suppose I was thinking over the last few days about what reading means to me, and I kind of came to the realisation that reading has been a lifelong friend for me. I grew up in Kilkenny, small household. There was only my mum, myself, and my younger brother. My dad died when I was at a very young age, and as you know, in Kilkenny, it's all about hurling. And if you're not a good hurler, and it was good enough, but in Kilkenny you have to be really, really good. There's very little very little else in terms of sports. So reading, I kind of gravitated towards reading. And there's a few things that stick out in my mind in terms of my reading as a young fella. I remember the joy of reading my very first big book, The Twits by Roald Dahl, which I couldn't tell anyone the night that I finished reading it, because I was actually up late in the bed reading through a crack in the door. So my joy was kept contained. And another big memory of I suppose my reading life. I suppose I was never the quickest in school. I was good. I was all the rest of it, but I actually had to repeat sixth class, and it was only afterwards that I realised that I spent the whole year reading The Lord of the Rings under the desk, and I wasn't able to concentrate on my schoolwork. Or I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, Martina, about fear, and I was an anxious child, and I had huge fear about schoolwork, and probably needlessly so, but because it wasn't forced on me at home. My mother had a very good attitude to education and the value of it, but never put pressure on us in that sense. And our living room was full of books, and I just started reading, and I read every book on my own shelves, then started at my mum and dad's collection of books, and probably reading stuff that I shouldn't have been reading, but I learned a huge amount, and it gave me freedom, it gave me escape, it gave me happiness. I learned so much. I traveled the world. I learned an awful lot about history, everything. It opened up a world to me that I didn't realise was even possible from my house in Kilkenny. And then, of course, I discovered the library, and that was a whole new journey again.
So tell us about when you joined the library. Did one of your parents bring you there and sign you up, or did you just discover it yourself?
Yeah, I think Mum would have brought us into the library, and of course the schools. I mean, primary schools. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and there wasn't a huge amount on TV as it was. We weren't allowed to watch TV during the week in my house, and we were at weekends. So books and the library became just a central part of my life, and it was somewhere we could go. It was somewhere I could go as a young teenager or a young person. It was an open, welcoming, free, democratic space that you could just be, and no one was going to ask you any questions. And of course, when I became a teenager, you get in there, you get access to the teenage books, but of course, with access to the teenage books, you were automatically allowed to borrow all the adult books as well. So I was, my mind was blown. I was reading all sorts of things. I was reading Stephen King's full catalogue and frightening the hell out of myself. And, a huge amount. I had a fascination then, I suppose, with world wars, and I read all of that kind of stuff. And I used to lose track of time completely. It's one of the joys of reading, you just get wrapped up in it and transported to a different world. And I know Sarah will talk later about the freedom and the escape of reading, but my main thing was fiction. And I just found everything outside of my own beautiful small town of Kilkenny, my city, I should say. It was a whole other world out there that I couldn't wait for. And I suppose that led me on then. It created opportunities for me. My own ability increased, my understanding of schoolwork increased. It helped me connect with like-minded people as well, pre-social media and all of that. And I eventually ended up then working in libraries. And I would say,
Hi, John.
totally biased.
Can I just ask you here, John, how have the libraries adapted to lockdown? Because, that world you're describing, the teenager able to go to the library on their own after school, is no longer available. Are there any alternatives?
There's loads of alternatives. I suppose over the last number of years, Libraries Ireland and all public libraries in Ireland have invested heavily in online services. So there's a huge collection of, 40 odd thousand ebooks available through BorrowBox, about 30 odd thousand e-audiobooks that I know Sabina mentioned earlier on. There's magazines, 4,000 magazines. There's something for everyone in your local library, regardless. But like, it's not our natural state to have our doors closed, and we've had to respond in different ways, whether that's putting events online or engaging with our customers through social media and with the communities around us. But to have, if you actually think about it, to have a collection of 40,000 books available on your phone, on your computer, on your tablet, it's a whole other world, really. It's fantastic.
I think I read that there were 12 million items in all the libraries
Correct.
around Ireland, between magazines and newspapers, everything really.
Yeah, you're spot on, Martina. In terms of our
Explain about
physical collection in
explain
our
about
libraries in our country.
explain about Borrow Books to people.
Yeah, BorrowBox is it's an app or a website, but the main usage is through the app. So if you go on to librariesireland.ie or your local public library website, you can go in, look for the BorrowBox link, register with your library card and your name, and then you have access and you can download it. I know Sabina mentioned Audible earlier on, so it has ebooks, which is just text of books, and then you have like Audible, you have the e-audio books, so you can listen to a book. And for the likes of me now, I mean, I have the challenge for me for these days is finding the time to read, and I find
Don't say
with
that.
BorrowBox,
Don't say that, John.
look behind me. It's fine. I'm reading all day long, but it's not necessarily what I want to read for pleasure, certainly. But it's you can read it on, as I said, on your phone. If you're waiting for the bus, you can tune in for 10 minutes. Be opportunistic about your reading. Take your chances. Listen to the audiobook when you're doing the washing up. I hate the washing up. To get me through it will help. As Sabina said, go out for a walk and listen to it. It doesn't really matter what you're reading, as long as you're getting, that you're, I suppose, caught up in what you're reading and enjoying it.
This escape into another world that books offer you.
Absolutely.
Do you find listening to books a different experience to reading?
A lot of it depends as well. If you don't like the narrator or the narrator's voice, sometimes it can kind of take a little bit of time to get used to. I listen to audiobooks a lot when I'm driving to and from work. I work in Carlow, I live in Kilkenny. It's a short commute, but it's that sacred half an hour that I have every morning and every evening that allows me to let the working world behind me and kind of go on home. So sometimes you lose concentration and you might need to go back and re-listen to a chapter, but that's fine. And it's with technology nowadays, it's so easy. I suppose for me, it gives me the freedom to listen when you come home and your eyes are tired after a day looking at a screen
Right.
or a day of reading, and sometimes it's just easier to lie there or sit there and listen.
And you're still exercising the imagination, aren't you? What do
Yes.
people say to you about reading in the libraries when they enter libraries? I mean, obviously, haven't been able to for a while, but the doors will be open again. What sorts of comments do you get from borrowers?
I suppose it's quite clear to us that people are missing their library. People come into the library, they don't just come in for books. They come in to read the newspaper, they come in to surf the internet, magazines, even if no matter what you're interested in, children, of course. People come in, it's very interesting. One of the things that opened me up to literacy in Ireland, I remember when the driver theory test came out with the audio. So, it was on CD-ROM and you were only able to read it prior to that and take your test. But for people with difficulty reading, the audio aspect of it was so important. They were able to do their driver theory test and progress on. But that's what libraries are about. They're there for everyone. They're a universal kind of. And if you think about it, there's very few institutions or buildings or anything where everything is free, pretty much. You can sit down and relax. As I said, you can read the paper, you can read magazines, you can just close your eyes and contemplate and think, look out the window. So our communities on social media are constantly asking us when we're going to open up again, and we can't do. They're missing their reading, they're missing the contact and the connection, and that's one of the wonderful things about reading as well, is that you don't need to connect with the author or the characters or the different country or outer space or wherever the subject of the book is, but it gives you the opportunity to connect with other people. And I would say, particularly in lockdown, I know some libraries we currently don't have in Carlow at the moment, but I know in Wexford and Kildare, I think they have an online book club. You have the likes of the Ricochet book club. Connect with other people that are reading and be inspired and have conversations and get tips and get recommendations, and go onto the Ireland Reads website. There's a facility on that you can type in what you like reading in general, and it'll come up with a few suggestions to you. So we can't wait to get our people back into our libraries.
Oh, we can't wait for the library doors to open either. Will you squeeze in a read tomorrow? There's hundreds of thousands of minutes pledged already.
There is. I was just looking before I came on, and there's 448,780 minutes pledged as of an hour ago. It's amazing to see the response. And yes, I will be squeezing in a read, and a few of them if I can, even if it's only for 5 minutes at a time.
What will you squeeze in?
Well, I am listening to American Dirt, which is a fascinating book, absolutely brilliant. So I'll do that, and I'm actually working from home tomorrow. So
that's by
Janine
Cummings, is it?
I can't remember. Oh God, I think so.
Oh,
I'm
always give the
brutal
author's name, speaking like an author.
I'm so sorry. I'll put it into the chat in a minute. I'm reading a book called Burning the Books, which is an interesting one, and I do remember that's Richard Ovenden. So I'll try and take in a few minutes of both of those, both on audio and in text tomorrow.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. Now, just to say, we've been having some comments from all of you listening at home, listening and watching at home, I should say, and one from Shauna just saying how fascinating she's finding it. So thank you for that, Shauna. If any of you have questions for our panel, do please text them in online. And now I'm moving on to award-winning children's author and creative writing teacher and all-round champion of reading, Sarah Webb. Sarah has written an Eiffel Tower-sized pile of books. Her latest is The Little Bee Charmer of Henrietta Street, and that's out this autumn. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Martina.
You didn't immediately take to reading as a child.
No. While the other children in school were reading at maybe 6 or 7, I didn't really take to reading till I was nearly 10. I think I was 9 3/4. So I had quite a long reading delay. I was trying to read, and my mum was a primary school teacher, so she was very aware that I was having difficulties in school, and it made me a very grumpy child in school for many years. But luckily I had parents who were really big book fans, and our house had a lot of books in it, and because my mum was a teacher, she knew that reading to me was really important. So I was read to a lot, and I really wanted to be able to read. So it finally clicked by the time I was 9 3/4, nearly 10. What it did give me was a great love of story and a great love of being read to. So like John and Sabina was saying, Sabina's husband loves audiobooks, as does John. I'm a big fan of listening to podcasts like your City of Books one, and I love listening to audiobooks as well. So I get my books in all kinds of different ways.
Sarah, what does reading give us?
Well, I suppose Sabina was talking about kind of the maybe more academic kind of things like resting your brain and how it helps you relax. And but for me, at a very basic level, it gives me a lot of comfort and a lot of joy. I love reading. I read for information. I read for work. I read to find out things, but most of all, I read to comfort myself, to make myself happy, because I think, again, it was Sabina said, when you're really, really immersed in a cracking book and the story is amazing and you're stepping into the character's shoes, everything else kind of drifts away, and you're just in that story and you're with those characters and you're living that story with them. And I love when you find a really, really good book and you just can't, you're looking forward to going to bed for your half an hour, you're an hour reading, and you just can't wait. And you might be sneaking your book, during the day, you go into just one chapter. I love finding, and it doesn't happen all that often, but when it does happen, it's really, really magical.
It teaches us empathy, I suppose, as well. We can put ourselves in someone else's position, see life from their perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I read a huge amount of different kinds of books for different age groups and genres, and I think empathy is a really interesting one, and there is, I can't remember now what it's called, Martina. I think it's National Empathy Day in the UK, but there's a whole movement around sharing books that particularly emphasize and promote empathy with children and young people. But yeah, no, I think it does definitely, it lets you see into other people's heads and to other people's lives, and it makes you realize sometimes what life is like for different types of people. Yeah, so it's really, really important. Yeah.
It's a window into the past as well, too, through historical fiction.
Yeah. I know you love historical fiction as well, and of course you've written some wonderful historical fiction. Yeah, I love reading good historical fiction. Fact books really interest me as well, but I think it's that magic of a really good story mixed with finding out about something. I love finding new things out in books, and for that reason I read so many different types of books. I love books about animals, about whales and dolphins, about the natural world. So you do. At the moment, I'm reading a lot of books about Dublin around the 1910, 1912 time. I've just finished reading a book called Darkest Dublin, which is all about the Church Street collapses of 1913. And it's so interesting. And it definitely
were these tenement collapses?
Yeah, there were 2 tenement houses that went down in 1913 due to a bad structure. Basically, they hadn't been looked after, negligent landlords. The landlords were councillors from Dublin Corporation at the time. The owners of those particular houses that went down was a woman. I think she was called Mrs. Murphy, who owned the building supplies. But it's just so interesting. But it I always find history ties in with a lot of things in the modern world. So it kind of got me thinking about childhood poverty and about how difficult it is at the moment, because some children do not have a computer or any way of studying online or joining their class online, and how, as a society, poverty really impacts on children. So, I think when you're reading history, other things kind of come in, and you start thinking about things like direct provision and how difficult it is. It would be trying to educate a child in direct provision, these kind of things.
You mentioned comfort earlier, and I was thinking how important it is in this era of COVID. Do you find comfort in books, and which books?
Oh, a huge amount. I've since last year I don't know about everyone else, but I found it really difficult. So Sabina has told us a little bit about why to concentrate at the beginning of the first lockdown. So last March, April, my concentration was shot. So I went back to books that I'd read before, books that were really comforting to me, and I could concentrate on them because I kind of knew what was coming next. And then I went back also to short form things like graphic novels, which I love, and poetry. I read a lot of poetry. So I think for me, reading something that you either know the author and you know you'll really enjoy that book, or you know the actual book, or you know the poem. I find that really, really comforting. So I read a lot of Mary Oliver, who's an American poet who died a couple of years ago. She writes a lot about nature and about animals. And I reread quite a few books in the last year, one called The Secret Life of Bees. I put them beside me because I can never, I'm like John, I can never remember the author, even though I've read this one several times. So it's Sue Monk Kidd. And it's this wonderful book here, and it's about beekeeping. It's about the American South in the 1950s. It's about race. Oh, it's just such a wonderful book. So I've read this 3 times since the first lockdown.
What else you got there?
I have, as I was saying, I read a lot of children's books for both work and pleasure. I think children's books have a huge amount of hope in them. And I found a lot of adults I've been talking to, including my own mum, have really gone back to reading children's books and are getting a lot from them. And this was one I really, really enjoyed recently. This is called The Valley of Lost Secrets she's Louise Parry, a Welsh author, and it is set in 1939 during the war, Second World War, and it's about evacuees who go and live to stay in a Welsh mining town, and there's a secret involved there. Other ones I've loved, The Great Gatsby. I love The Great Gatsby. I read lots. I don't know how many times. Is there a book you go back to over and over again, Martina? I know you love the Brontes.
I do. I went back to Jane Eyre during lockdown, partly for that wonderful line in it, which I remember reading as a teenager, and it still astonishes me. She says in it to Mr. Rochester, "I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I'm a free human being with an independent will." And that was an extraordinarily strong statement of female independence, considering the book was written in 1847. So there was no vote for women, and they had very weak status. So I think that Charlotte Bronte must have been an extraordinary person. But then, of course, if I like the novel, I want to find out, like Michael, about a person's life. I become interested in the person who wrote those stories.
So The Great Gatsby. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to ask you about The Great Gatsby.
Yeah, so The Great Gatsby is one I go back to often because I just love the language, and it's nice and short, and I like a short book. And this is a graphic novel version of The Great Gatsby. I love graphic novels, and this is using all the original language. It's just slightly abridged, and obviously it has these wonderful illustrations. But I've been reading that over the last few days, and I've been really enjoying it. I try to read Gatsby maybe every year, and I always find it's interesting. I always find new things in it to read.
Like what? What new things do you find?
As I get older, I identify with, like, I find, unfortunately, Daisy, I find her quite annoying now. Whereas when I was younger, I really liked Daisy as a character. I really, 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 really want to give Gatsby a big hug now, kind of as a kind of mother. You know, my heart goes out to him now. It actually makes me quite sad reading it now, in a way I didn't really see when I was in my 20s. Nick, I can kind of, he's the narrator of the story. But Gatsby, who's the main character, I just wanted to give him a hug, Martina. But you know, and I think what happens when you read...
Can't do that you can't do that in the era of COVID.
I can't do that.
No,
but I think what happens when you read things at different stages of your life is you have changed. So you bring your experiences and your thoughts as a slightly older reader to it. So I read it first in school, and then I read it again in college, and then I read it as a younger woman, and now reading it now, it's a really different experience. You're probably the same with the Brontes, you know, you get different things out of it because you bring different things to it. And I think that's the incredible thing about reading, in that a book is just little black marks on a page, you know, that's all it is. But you bring everything to those marks, and every one of us brings something slightly different. So I can read a book and you can read a book, and we'll have a completely different experience of it. And I just think that is so magical. You know, it really is, because it's painting pictures in your mind of how things look or how things are. But my picture might be very different to yours. And I think there's a big difference between watching a television program or a film of a book and reading the book. You know, the book lives in your head, whereas the movie or the film's being brought to you with someone else's vision. And I remember seeing Harry Potter for the first time and going, that's not Harry Potter. Harry Potter's a skinny fellow. He's taller, you know. It's just, reading really is quite magical, isn't it?
So John was saying something to that effect, that when the voice, when the narrator, and how you hear the story in your head, it can affect the story you're hearing. Yeah. Do you want to end with a little bit of poetry, Sarah, since you mentioned poetry? It might be useful for people as a little burst.
Yeah, sure. Well, I pulled out, can I just mention this book here, because it's one of my favourite books I read over lockdown. It's called Dear Reader, and it's by Kathy Rentzenbrink, maybe. And it is about... it's about the comfort and joy of reading. She talks about some of her favourite books growing up and now, and it's beautifully written. And there's just a gorgeous bit at the end, which I'll read you because it's really, really short. She says, "Once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved books. She still does. She always will." I just think, oh, that's so lovely. But it's really
girl. She's that little girl.
It's her.
It's her. It's an exploration of her reading history.
Yeah. So just on the poetry, I'll just pull out this one, and I have a Mary Oliver book somewhere. I love poetry collections, and I often find them in the library, and I deeply miss libraries. But this one is called She is Fierce by Anna Sampson, and it's a collection of incredible poetry by women, and they're kind of grouped into different categories like fierceness and bravery, and but it's absolutely amazing. And I'll end just with one of my favorite poets at the moment, because this changes a lot over time, which is Mary Oliver. And I think people know her poem The Summer Day really well, because it has really famous last two lines. And she says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" I just love those lines. Isn't it? She's a terrific poet, really accessible. I think sometimes people think, oh, poetry, that's for someone else. But I just love poetry, and, you know, I'll read all kinds of different. But I just like poems that speak to me, that say something to me. And she definitely talks to me. So, I'd highly recommend Mary Oliver.
Lovely. Sarah, thank you for that. We've had some comments and questions in. Siobhan very kindly does remind us that Janine Cummings wrote American Dirt. I think I said that. Dolores says, great talks all around. And another Siobhan says, how interesting it was to hear Sabina's deep dive of the brain. Include more of this, please, in reading events in the future. Monaghan Library says, Sarah is an advocate for children's books and reading, and it's great to see her here today. Well said. And Mary loves Borrow Books, as does her son. They listen to it. He listens to it every night. Philomena says, great talks and wonderful information. Kira says, great to see that reading can come in many forms and become part of our lives at different times and for different reasons. Aren't they amazing comments? Well done, everybody. Thank you for sending them in. So we're coming to the end of this webinar. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you also to NALA and to Libraries Ireland who collaborated to organise this event. Great teamwork. Thanks also to our contributors, Michael Duffy, Dr. Sabina Brennan, John Shortall and Sarah Webb. The webinar was recorded and it will be available online for you to watch again or share with others. Look for the link on the Ireland Reads and NALA websites, and don't forget that free phone number 1800 20 20 65. Also tomorrow, Thursday, is a national day set aside to celebrate reading, so join in by reading yourself. Tune in to online at 7 p.m. tomorrow for another webinar, this one chaired by broadcaster Rick O'Shea, and more details on www.irelandreads.ie. Until then, this is Martina Devlin saying there's a world of reading out there just waiting especially for you. Go find it. You won't be disappointed. Na 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 na.